The Book of Esther, also known in Hebrew as the Scroll, the Megillah, is a book in the third section Ketuvim, writings of the Hebrew Bible. It is one of the 5 scrolls, Megillot, in the Hebrew Bible and later became part of the Christian Old Testament. The book relates the story of a Jewish woman in Persia, born as Hadassah but known as Esther, who becomes queen of Persia and thwarts a genocide of her people. The story takes place during the reign of King Ahasuerus in the First Persian Empire. Queen Vashti, the wife of King Ahasuerus, is banished from the court for disobeying the king's orders. A beauty pageant is held to find a new queen, and Esther, a young Jewish woman living in Persia, is chosen as the new queen. Esther's cousin Mordecai, who is a Jewish leader, discovers a plot to kill all of the Jews in the empire by Haman, one of the king's advisors. Mordecai urges Esther to use her position as queen to intervene and save their people. Esther reveals her Jewish identity to the king and begs for mercy for her people. She exposes Haman's plot and convinces the king to spare the Jews. The Jewish festival of Purim is established to celebrate the victory of the Jews of the First Persian Empire over their enemies, and Esther becomes a heroine of the Jewish people. The books of Esther and Song of Songs are the only books in the Hebrew Bible that do not mention God explicitly. Traditional Judaism views the absence of God's overt intervention in the story as an example of how God can work through seemingly coincidental events and the actions of individuals. The book is at the center of the Jewish festival of Purim and is read aloud twice from a handwritten scroll, usually in a synagogue, during the holiday, once in the evening and again the following morning. The distribution of charity to those in need and the exchange of gifts of foods are also practices observed on the holiday that are mandated in the book. Although traditionally seen as a historical document, according to biblical scholars, the narrative of Esther was written to provide an etiology for Purim's origin. The biblical Book of Esther is set in the Persian capital of Susa, Shushan, in the 3rd year of the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus. The name Ahasuerus is equivalent to Xerxes, both deriving from the Persian Xšayārša, and Ahasuerus is usually identified in modern sources as Xerxes I, who ruled between 486 and 465 before Christ, as it is to this monarch that the events described in Esther are thought to fit the most closely. Assuming that Ahasuerus is indeed Xerxes I, the events described in Esther began around the years 483 to 482 before Christ, and concluded in March 473 before Christ. Classical sources such as Josephus, the Jewish commentary Esther Rabbah and the Christian theologian Bar Hebraeus, as well as the Greek Septuagint translation of Esther, instead identify Ahasuerus as either Artaxerxes I, reigned 465 to 424 before Christ, or Artaxerxes II, reigned 404 to 358 before Christ. On his accession, however, Artaxerxes II lost Egypt to Pharaoh Emertius, after which it was no longer part of the Persian Empire. In his Historia Scholastica Petrus Commaster identified Ahasuerus, Esther 1 verse 1, as Artaxerxes III, 358 to 338 before Christ, who reconquered Egypt. Some traditional scholars identify Ahasuerus as Cambyses II due to alignment with traditional Jewish sources including Seder Olam Rabbah. The plot is structured around banquets, a word that occurs 20 times in Esther and only 24 times in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. This is appropriate given that Esther describes the origin of a Jewish feast, the Feast of Purim, but Purim itself is not the subject and no individual feast in the book is commemorated by Purim. The book's theme, rather, is the reversal of destiny through a sudden and unexpected turn of events, the Jews seem destined to be destroyed, but instead are saved. In literary criticism, such a reversal is termed peripety, and while on one level its use in Esther is simply a literary or aesthetic device, on another it is structural to the author's theme, suggesting that the power of God is at work behind human events. The Megillat Esther, Book of Esther, became the last of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible to be canonized by the sages of the Great Assembly. According to the Talmud, it was a redaction by the Great Assembly of an original text by Mordecai. It is usually dated to the 4th century before Christ. The Greek Book of Esther, included in the Septuagint, is a retelling of the events of the Hebrew Book of Esther rather than a translation, and records additional traditions which do not appear in the traditional Hebrew version, in particular the identification of Ahasuerus with Artaxerxes II and details of various letters. It is dated around the late 2nd to early 1st century before Christ. The Coptic and Ethiopic versions of Esther are translations of the Greek rather than the Hebrew Esther. A Latin version of Esther was produced by Jerome for the Vulgate. It translates the Hebrew Esther but interpolates translations of the Greek Esther where the latter provides additional material. Predating the Vulgate, however, the Vetus Latina, Old Latin, was apparently translated from a different Greek version not included in the Septuagint. Several Aramaic Targumim of Esther were produced in the Middle Ages, of which 3 survive: the Targum Rishon, First Targum, and Targum Sheni, Second Targum, dated c. 500 to 1000 after Christ, which include additional legends relating to Purim, and the Targum Shalishi, Third Targum, which Berliner and Goshen Gottstein argued was the Ur Targum from which the others had been expanded, but which others consider only a late recension of the same. The Third Targum is the most manuscript stable of the 3, and by far the most literal. The story told in the Book of Esther takes place during the rule of Ahasuerus, who amongst others has been identified as the 5th century Persian king Xerxes I, reigned 486 to 465 before Christ. The author also displays an accurate knowledge of Persian customs and palaces. Those arguing in favor of a historical reading of Esther most commonly identify Ahasuerus with Xerxes I, ruled 486 to 465 before Christ, although in the past it was often assumed that he was Artaxerxes II, ruled 405 to 359 before Christ. The Hebrew Ahasuerus is most likely derived from Persian Xšayārša, the origin of the Greek Xerxes. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Xerxes sought his harem after being defeated in the Greco-Persian Wars. He makes no reference to individual members of the harem except for a domineering queen consort named Amestris, whose father, Otanes, was one of Xerxes's generals. In contrast, the Greek historian Ctesias refers to a similar father-in-law general figure named Onaphas. Amestris has often been identified with Vashti, but this identification is problematic, as Amestris remained a powerful figure well into the reign of her son, Artaxerxes I, whereas Vashti is portrayed as dismissed in the early part of Xerxes's reign. Alternative attempts have been made to identify her with Esther, although Esther is an orphan whose father was a Jew named Abihail. As for the identity of Mordecai, the similar names Marduka and Marduku have been found as the name of officials in the Persian court in over 30 texts from the period of Xerxes I and his father Darius I, and may refer to up to 4 individuals, one of whom might be the model for the biblical Mordecai. The Old Greek Septuagint version of Esther translates the name Ahasuerus as Artaxerxes, a Greek name derived from the Persian Artaxerxes. Josephus too relates that this was the name by which he was known to the Greeks, and the Midrashic text Esther Rabbah also makes the identification. Bar Hebraeus identified Ahasuerus explicitly as Artaxerxes II, However, the names are not necessarily equivalent. Hebrew has a form of the name Artaxerxes distinct from Ahasuerus Artashasta. A direct Greek rendering of Ahasuerus is used by both Josephus and the Septuagint for occurrences of the name outside the Book of Esther. Instead, the Hebrew name Ahasuerus accords with an inscription of the time that notes that Artaxerxes II was named also Arsu, understood as a shortening of the Babylonian rendering of the Persian Xšayārša, Xerxes, through which the Hebrew Ahasuerus is derived. Tejas related that Artaxerxes II was also called Arsaces, which is understood as a similar shortening with the Persian suffix ku that is applied to shortened names. Danon related that Artaxerxes II was also called Orzes, which is also understood to be derived from Xšayārša. Another view attempts to identify him instead with Artaxerxes I, ruled 465 to 424 before Christ, whose Babylonian concubine, Cosmatidine, was the mother of his son Darius II, ruled 424 to 405 before Christ. Jewish tradition relates that Esther was the mother of a king Darius, and so some try to identify Ahasuerus with Artaxerxes I and Esther with Cosmatidine. Based on the view that the Ahasuerus of the Book of Tobit is identical with that of the Book of Esther, some have also identified him as Nebuchadnezzar's ally Cyaxares, ruled 625 to 585 before Christ. In certain manuscripts of Tobit, the former is called Achiacha, which, like the Greek Cyaxares, is thought to be derived from Persian Huwaksara. Depending on the interpretation of Esther 2 verses 5 to 6, Mordecai or his great-grandfather Kish was carried away from Jerusalem with Jeconiah by Nebuchadnezzar in 597 before Christ. The view that it was Mordecai would be consistent with the identification of Ahasuerus with Cyaxares. Identifications with other Persian monarchs have also been suggested. Jacob Hochanda has argued that the name of Haman and that of his father Hammedatha are mentioned by Strabo as Omanus and Anidatus, worshipped with Anahita in the city of Zela. Hochanda suggests that Haman may, if the connection is correct, be a priestly title and not a proper name. Strabo's names are unattested in Persian texts as gods. However, the Talmud and Josephus interpret the description of courtiers bowing to Haman in Esther 3 verse 2 as worship. Other scholars assume Omanus refers to Voumana. In his Historia Scholastica Petrus Commaster identified Ahasuerus, Esther 1 verse 1, as Artaxerxes III who reconquered Egypt. In the Book of Esther, the Tetragrammaton does not appear, but some argue it is present, in hidden form, in 4 complex acrostics in Hebrew, the initial or last letters of 4 consecutive words, either forwards or backwards, comprise YHWH. These letters were distinguished in at least 3 ancient Hebrew manuscripts in red. Christine Hayes contrasts the Book of Esther with apocalyptic writings, the Book of Daniel in particular. Both Esther and Daniel depict an existential threat to the Jewish people, but while Daniel commands the Jews to wait faithfully for God to resolve the crisis, in Esther the crisis is resolved entirely through human action and national solidarity. God, in fact, is not mentioned. Esther is portrayed as assimilated to Persian culture, and Jewish identity in the book is an ethnic category rather than a religious one. This contrasts with traditional Jewish commentaries, such as the commentary of the Vilna Gaon, which states, but in every verse it discusses the great miracle. However, this miracle was in a hidden form, occurring through apparently natural processes, not like the Exodus from Egypt, which openly revealed the might of God. This follows the approach of the Talmud, which states that the Book of Esther is referenced in the Torah in the verse, "And I shall surely hide," in Hebrew, Hester Esther, related to Esther, my face from them on that day. André Lecoq also sees the Book of Esther as being fundamentally theological and that its main message was to correct the mistakes of ancestors. These mistakes included being lenient against Amalekites and plundering goods, which King Saul was guilty of. Another message was that diasporic Jews were responsible for the welfare of their host community, who held unpredictable views about Jews. These views ranged from violent anti-Semitism to passionate philo-Semitism. Lecoq compares this to Joseph's governance of Egypt in the Book of Genesis, which benefited native Egyptians and Hebrew immigrants. Although marriages between Jews and Gentiles are not permitted in Orthodox Judaism, even in case of pikuach nefesh, Esther is not regarded as a sinner, because she remained passive and risked her life to save that of the entire Jewish people. Aziz Pajand, a Persian Jew, published Purim in 1966, which offered an Iranophilic interpretation of the Book of Esther. Here, Haman was the Amalekite enemy of a pure-blooded Iranians and Jews. Thus, Purim became a holiday that celebrates salvation for all Iranians from the Hamanites. He also emphasizes the role of Jewish-Persian cooperation in realizing the Book of Esther's denouement. Pajand justified his interpretation to dispel accusations that the Book of Esther was anti-Iranian and because he believed that Iranians were travelers in the way of truth. In contrast, Haman violated the Zoroastrian ideal of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Lecoq likewise observes that the enemies of the Jews were never arbitrarily branded as Amalekites before being killed, in comparison to Haman and his sons, which discredits any motive of Jewish ultranationalism. Albert Barnes similarly argues that the philo-Semitic Persian establishment was perplexed at Haman's decree, Esther 3 verse 15, and that they were supportive of Esther's efforts against the enemies of the Jews. The latter were mostly found among the idolatrous people of the subject nations, whom the Persians did not care for. The ones in Susa, however, consisted of Haman's faction, led by his 10 sons, and fugitives who believed they were free to kill the Jews once the latter's privileges have expired, thus why they were killed the next day. Matthew Poole sees the subsequent hanging of Haman's sons as a cruel Jewish and Persian custom that punishes offenders for abusing the king. John Gill sees the conversion of Persian allies, Esther 8 verse 17, as an example of conversion under duress but does not discount alternative explanations. They include being impressed by the divine providence working in the Jews' favor and seeking the favor of Esther and Mordecai, who gained immense power. But ultimately, the Persian allies and Jews celebrated Purim together and taught their children to read the Book of Esther, Esther 9 verse 27. According to Rabbi Mordecai Neugroschel, there is a code in the Book of Esther which lies in the names of Haman's 10 sons. 3 of the Hebrew letters, a tav, a shin, and a zayin, are written smaller than the rest, while a vav is written larger. The outsized vav, which represents the number 6, corresponds to the 6th millennium of the world since creation, which, according to Jewish tradition, is the period between 1240 and 2240 after Christ. As for the tav, shin, and zayin, their numerical values add up to 707. Put together, these letters refer to the Jewish year 5707, which corresponds to the secular 1946 to 1947. In his research, Neugroschel noticed that 10 Nazi defendants in the Nuremberg trials were executed by hanging on the 16th of October, 1946, which was the date of the final judgment day of Judaism, Hosanna Rabbah. Additionally, Hermann Göring, an 11th Nazi official sentenced to death, committed suicide, parallel to Haman's daughter in tractate Megillah. An additional 6 chapters appear interspersed in Esther in the Septuagint, an early Greek translation of the Bible. This was noted by Jerome in compiling the Latin Vulgate. Additionally, the Greek text contains many small changes in the meaning of the main text. Jerome recognized the former as additions not present in the Hebrew text and placed them at the end of his Latin translation. This placement is used in Catholic Bible translations based primarily on the Vulgate, such as the Douay-Rheims Bible and the Knox Bible, with chapters numbered up to 16. In contrast, the Nova Vulgata incorporates the additions to Esther directly into the narrative itself, as do most modern Catholic English translations based on the original Hebrew and Greek, Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, New American Bible, New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. The numbering system for the editions therefore differs with each translation. The Nova Vulgata accounts for the additional verses by numbering them as extensions of the verses immediately following or preceding them. Esther 11 verses 2 to 12 in the Old Vulgate becomes Esther 1:1a a 1k in the Nova Vulgata, while the NAB and its successor, the Neighbor, assign letters of the alphabet as chapter headings for the editions. Esther 11:2. 12:6 in the Vulgate becomes Esther 8:1-17. The RSVCE and the NRSVCE place the additional material into the narrative, but retain the chapter and verse numbering of the Old Vulgate. The canonicity of these Greek editions has been a subject of scholarly disagreement practically since their first appearance in the Septuagint. Martin Luther, being perhaps the most vocal Reformation-era critic of the work, considered even the original Hebrew version to be of very doubtful value. The Council of Basel-Ferrara, Florence confirmed its status as canonical between 1431 and 1445. The Council of Trent, the summation of the Counter-Reformation, reconfirmed the entire book, both Hebrew text and Greek editions, as canonical. The Book of Esther is used twice in commonly used sections of the Catholic lectionary. In both cases, the text used is not only taken from a Greek edition. The readings also include the prayer of Mordecai, and nothing of Esther's own words is ever used. The Eastern Orthodox Church uses the Septuagint version of Esther, as it does for all of the Old Testament. In contrast, the additions are included in the Biblical Apocrypha, usually printed in a separate section, if at all, in Protestant Bibles. The additions, called the rest of the Book of Esther, are specifically listed in the 39 Articles, Article 6, of the Church of England as non-canonical, though read for example of life and instruction of manners. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.